let's get started. So we spoke at the last class about the animal soul. That we said every Jew has two souls, an animal soul, and we're soon going to say a godly soul. And the animal soul has three functions. One, it keeps the body alive. Two, it makes you do bad stuff. And three, by Jews, it makes you do certain good stuff. So we talked about the bad stuff being fire, water, air, and dust, right? Anger and things like that come from fire. Pleasurable delights, lustful desires come from water. Silliness comes from air. And depression, sadness comes from earth. And then we said that besides for these negative things, which the animal soul is most famous for, he says you have to realize that the animal soul also by Jews produce two inborn qualities, which are Rachmanus and Gemilas Chasadim, pity or compassion and kindness. As it's known, the Talmud says that there's a sign how to tell if somebody's Jewish. Well, that's not what he says, but he says there's three symbols that are characteristic of Jews, and that is that they're kind, they're bashful, and they're giving. They're compassionate, bashful, and giving. Now, the bashfulness, it's explained, came from Matan Torah when we were revealed God on Mount Sinai. That caused a sense of bashfulness permanently. But the inborn natural bashfulness, which actually comes from the Jewish animal soul, the inborn traits that comes from the Jewish animal soul includes compassion and kindness. Now, the question is then, one second, is this a bad soul or a good soul? What's going on here? So he said that this soul, even though it's from Klipa, and Klipa means a shell, or Sitra Achra, it's the other side. It's not the side of holiness. And seemingly, if something's on the side of holiness, it's holy, and if it's on the other side, it should be bad. So why do we have good characteristics in a bad soul? So he's saying, no, this is not completely bad. This is what we call klipas naiga. It's a shining klipa. It's shining bad. It's bad with a silver lining, if you want to call it that. Why? Because this is really the kind of klipa that has a mixture of good and evil. And this is a deeper meaning of the term Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, just like a tree produces good and evil, or that tree, I should say, not a tree, the tree we're referring to produces good and evil, so too this klipa, this shell, this sitra achra produces evil, yes, all the negative characteristics, but also produces some good. So from here we see the two opposites in the nature of the animal soul of the Jewish people, that it possesses evil characteristics, but also positive characteristics. So in short, the klipa soul of a Jew has three components. Number one, it vivifies the body. Number two, it's the source of all negative characteristics. And number three, since it comes from this shining klipa, which is mixed of good and evil, therefore it also has good characteristics. So it's interesting, if you look back at the order with which the Alter Rebbe describes the animal soul, he describes that the animal soul encloses itself in the blood of a person to vivify the body. And after establishing that as, the primary function, then he says, oh yes, from it come all the midas, all the negative characteristics and the positive characteristics and so forth. So what we see from this is that the very description of the animal soul as vivifying the body, being the primary description, tells us that vivifying a body is in itself klipa, right? Because this soul is a klipa soul. It's the other side soul. So now 1 second. What's wrong with keeping a body alive? Why is that a bad thing? So now we get to a very key point in the battle between good and evil that a person has to deal with on a regular basis, and how Hasidus explains this and helps us go through this battle. When we talk about something being on the side of evil, we're not just talking about the tendency to do bad things. That's not the side of evil per se. That's not the only thing that's the side of evil. If you don't mind, I'm just going to mute you because otherwise my screen keeps popping back and forth. But if you need to say something, feel free to unmute yourself. Okay. So the side of evil doesn't mean doing bad things, but just physical, natural life, keeping the body alive, is from the other side. Why? Because anything that is bodily and not holy is on the other side. As the Alter Rebbe writes in chapter 7, that anything that's in order to keep the body alive, if it's not exclusively for the sake of heaven, in order to serve Hashem with that body, then it's in the category of klipa and sitra achra. So in other words, anything that's not explicitly holy is implicitly unholy, or is by default unholy. Meaning not only is being heatedly excited about bodily pleasures something that's associated with klipa, but even keeping the body alive, just basic survival, if it's not permeated with something godly, if it's not directly focused on serving Hashem, then that is called klipa. In fact, it's brought in one of the famous Musar Svarim. Musar would be loosely translated as a rebuke, but Jewish theology, if you will, says that the Torah divides human behavior into 3 categories: a positive command, a negative warning, and things that are allowed. But the truth is, there's no such thing as the third option. It's either a positive commandment or it's a negative warning. Why? Because those things that are quote unquote allowed, either you're fulfilling a commandment to serve Hashem, or you're violating a negative commandment or a negative warning to not waste that power. Right? So since everybody's actions has to be for the sake of heaven, there's no such thing as a neutral action. There's no such thing as neutral activity. So you went jet skiing. No, is that a warning? Is that a negative commandment? No. But it could be. You need to find out. Did you do it for the sake of heaven or not? And that's how you know. Is it holy or is it klipa? It's a binary choice. Either it's holy or it's klipa. And if it's not holy, then automatically it's klipa. So therefore, what does it mean when Hasidus tells us we have to do inner work, that we have to uproot the evil from its source and change over a person's inside and depth to become holy? It doesn't begin with eradicating bad behavior or bad tendencies, but rather the main work is to change your very physical life, your basic human necessities and everyday living into something holy. So it doesn't, work in Hasidus doesn't mean that you stop you stop riding jet skis on Shabbos. That you're not allowed to do. That's not even a question. But the question is, when you have time off and you're riding that jet ski, are you doing it for a holy reason? Now, by the way, a way to tell if you're doing it for a holy reason or not is, are you looking to go jet skiing and that now you're trying to find a holy reason for it, or are you looking to do holy things and you happen to chance upon jet skiing as a holy way to serve Hashem? Maybe there's a way. I don't know. Maybe perhaps for some they find a way to serve Hashem. The exercise they get, I'm sure there's a way, but there only is a way because it's from this neutral klippa, from this klippa that could be used for holiness. So, anyways, the point is, avodah in Chassidus, working on oneself from a Chassidic perspective, doesn't just mean not doing bad things, but it means on working on your heart. As it says in the introduction of Tanya, the whole book is based on serving Hashem in your mouth and in your heart, in your feeling. So the more a person comes closer to love Hashem and to feel Hashem even closer, the more he'll distance himself from being drawn towards bodily pleasures and bodily pursuits. And thereby, he'll be working on making sure that all his activity and all his behavior, whatever it is, whether it's jet skiing, whether it's eating bread and cream cheese, whatever it might be, whether it's taking a walk in the morning, that it should all be for the sake of heaven. Now, that might sound out of reach. It might feel like, what do you mean? It sounds like I can never go on vacation. I can never enjoy myself. I can never eat pizza again in my life. So, I don't know. Maybe. Look, I can't promise you that after learning Tanya properly, you're still going to want to eat pizza. This is one of the disclaimers. You may never want to eat pizza or go jet skiing ever again. It's possible if you really learn Tanya properly. However, that's not the goal. That might be a byproduct. The goal is that if you're doing those things, it should be for the sake of heaven. And that certainly is within everybody's reach. That is, as the pasuk says, karev ma'od, very close and certainly attainable for everybody, as we'll explain further in Tanya. So that is the nature of the animal soul, that it has good things, it has bad things. But now let's just talk about, since we were talking about the Jewish animal soul, let's address the non-Jewish animal soul. Famous question I always get. You talk so much about Jews, what about non-Jews? So the truth is, I'm not an expert in non-Jewish philosophy or philosophy for non-Jews. And even the Alter Rebbe, who is an expert in Jewish philosophy, writes very little about non-Jews. But here he does. However, when it comes to the souls of the nations of the world, and here's an interesting fun fact, and that is that the Alter Rebbe, when he wrote the Tanya, he had to censor certain words. Because here he's drawing a distinction between Jews and non-Jews. Now that's, let's just say, politically incorrect. So in the original text of the Tanya, he writes, however, when it comes to the souls of the nations who worship idols, they're different. In other words, if you worship idols, then you're a different category. But if you don't worship idols, which the Russians, whatever, the communists or whatever predated the communists, they didn't physically bow down to idols. So that was enough to placate them and not make them feel like they're included in this distinction that the Alter Rebbe is making. But the truth is that, off camera, the Alter Rebbe clarified that he's talking about all nations of the world who are not Jewish. So, in fact, in the text that we have in front of us, if you have the JewishArcadia.com/7880 link, in most versions of the Tanya that you'll see today, it says that we're talking about the Jewish soul versus the not Jewish soul. Nothing about idols. So, however, when we're talking about the souls of the nations of the world, they are from the other three klipos, the impure klipos. Like we said, we have the shining klipa, which has some good in it. That's where the Jewish animal soul comes from. But the non-Jewish animal soul comes from the complete klipos, shein bahen taiv klal, that have no good within them. As it's written in Eitz Chaim, Tree of Life, that's a Kabbalistic book, Gate 49, Chapter 3. So this whole thing that the Klipa soul has some good in it is only when we're talking about the Jewish Klipa soul. But when we're talking about the non-Jews, these characteristics of compassion and goodness are not naturally inborn in them. Why? Because their souls come from the lower levels of klipos, which don't have any good in them. Now, to clarify, God is all good. God is all knowing. God is all powerful. And God is everywhere. And so there is no power in this world, even the powers of tumah and impurity, that are devoid of godliness. Of course, even the klipa has a godly spark which allows it to exist. So then how are we saying that these klipas have no good in them? So rather what we're trying to say is that these klipos completely conceal the godly spark in them, to the point that the godly spark is exiled within them, and there is no revealed expression of the light of holiness. And therefore we say that they have no good in them, meaning there's no good visible in them. But by contrast, when we're talking about the shining klipa, which does not completely hide the light of Kedusha, therefore some of the good is able to seep through. So since the nations of the world have their soul coming from the klipos that don't have any good shining, therefore they don't have these midos naturally, like by the Jewish people. Which by the Jewish people, even from their animal souls standpoint, they're naturally drawn towards kindness and compassion. Now, we should emphasize that this is the default understanding of what a Gentile is. However, as the Rambam writes, there is an exception to the rule called Chasidei Umay Sa'ilam, the righteous ones of the nations of the world, who actually have a portion of the world to come. And it's explained in Chassidus that their souls also come from the shining klipa. And in that case, they could be predisposed to these good tendencies. However, we're talking about the default and the vast majority, which their souls come from klipa. Now, so the question is, we see many people, meaning not the righteous Gentiles, just standard Gentiles, that do good and they do kindness. And so how could you say they have no good in them at all? So the Alter Rebbe explains, V'chol tivu da'avdin ha'umais legarmayu avdin. It's brought in the Zayar that all the good that the nations do, they do that for themselves. It's self-serving. Ukdeisa b'Gemara, as it says in the Talmud, Tractate Bava Basra, Al Pasuk, on the verse in Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 34, V'chesed le'umim chatas, the kindness of the nations is a sin. How could kindness be a sin? What do you mean? Kindness is kindness. So the Gemara explains, Shakal tzedakah v'chesed, she'umay ha'olam ha'isin, einon ela li'yisyarechulu. That all the kindness and all the righteousness and all the charity that the nations of the world do is only to boast in them, to show some sort of pride in themselves. In other words, they have some sort of pull, some sort of draw towards it, that there's some personal benefit being derived to themselves by doing that act of kindness. And so therefore, that act of kindness is not true altruistic kindness. Meaning to say, when we talk about the natural draw that a Jew has to do kindness, that even his animal soul pulls him to do kindness, we're talking about altruistic kindness, kindness for the sake of doing the kindness, meaning that you really care about the other party, and you want to help that other person, even if you get no personal benefit. And that type of kindness is attributed only to the Jewish people, whose animal soul comes from the klipas nega, which has in it good as well. And therefore, this soul wants to do good, and we're talking about even altruistic good. However, when we're talking about the nations of the world, whose souls come from the klipas, that the spark of holiness is absolutely hidden, they don't have this characteristic. They don't have this trait from which they can do kindness absolutely for the sake of the other. Rather, when they do kindness, it's because of some cause, some sort of external factor that's causing them to do that. However, we should clarify that when we say that they do it for themselves, there's different levels in self-serving kindness, right? There's the lowest level of self-serving kindness, which is literally you're doing kindness in order to gain some benefit. So you have a for-profit service where, I don't know, let's say you have an ambulance service and you charge $1,000 for a ride, right? So, and if somebody can't pay, you won't offer the ambulance service, right? So it's kindness. What do you mean? It's an ambulance service. You're saving lives. And you're right. You are saving lives. And we need more ambulance services. No, nobody's debating that. However, that's the lowest level of kindness because it's self-serving. However, there's another level of kindness, which is what's the return? Maybe not monetary. Maybe you get a certain pride. You get a certain status. You could show it on your Facebook and Instagram. Say, look how many sandwiches I delivered today at Union Station. Look at me. I'm such a kind person. Or you want to get a higher level than that is you don't want recognition or financial compensation from fellow humans, but you want to get reward from Hashem. You say, Hashem, I want you to pay me back. I want you to, pay up for everything that I did in the realm of kindness, be it in this world or on another level is I want to be repaid in the next world. And then there's different higher and higher, more refined levels of self-serving kindness. Like, for example, somebody who does kindness because they just can't stand the sight of somebody in pain. It makes them personally uncomfortable. So it might be subconscious, but the reality is, in order to placate their discomfort, they say, you know what, let me fix this situation so that I shouldn't feel uncomfortable. Now, in all of those cases, the person is doing kindness with himself in mind. Now, I think it's worthwhile to bring a story that's brought that what happened when the Alter Rebbe was arrested. The Alter Rebbe who authored the Tanya was arrested for writing the Tanya and other controversial things he said or did against the Russian government. Controversial things that he said, which the Russian government took personal, and things that he did, which were not against the government, but were contrived and misconstrued to have been against the government. But when he was arrested, they interrogated him, and they asked him many deep questions about his teachings, about his philosophical view on life. They asked him about the teachings of his predecessor, the Baal Shem Tov. And they asked him specifically about things he wrote in the Tanya. They asked him, how come you wrote that nations of the world have no good at all? So the story is told that the Alter Rebbe, the way the story is told is that the Alter Rebbe did not answer the question. He just looked at them and smiled, and they didn't answer any further. They didn't ask any further. They said, "Oh, what do you mean? Non-Jews don't do anything altruistically?" And the Alter Rebbe just smiled. And according to another slight variation of this story, is that the Alter Rebbe said that you see that I answered all your questions, and you saw that everything that I've answered was correct, and that I'm innocent with everything you've asked me. So, and that any question that you asked me to prove you something, I managed successfully to prove it. So if you want, I can prove this statement to you as well to prove it true. But you probably prefer if I didn't prove you that the statement was true as well. And they didn't question him further on this subject after that. So that's the story of the Alter Rebbe, and as it pertains to this particular what sounds like a somewhat controversial statement, the question has been raised before, and this is how the Alter Rebbe responded to it. So it turns out that the distinction between a Jew and a non-Jew is not only because of the neshama, the holy neshama, the godly neshama that a Jew has, which we're going to talk about next week in chapter 2, but even in regards to the klipa soul, the animal soul, the vivifying soul, there is a clear distinction in that the Jew has the ability to naturally do things, and the Gentile who doesn't have this type of soul doesn't naturally do these good things. Before we close up, let's do a full recap of chapter 1. So we started off with 4 questions. Number 1, how can our sages teach us that if the whole world tells you you're righteous, you should still consider yourself a rasha? We know that it's not a good idea to consider yourself a rasha. And also it might make you depressed and prevent you from serving Hashem properly. Or it might make you stop caring about the fact that you're a rasha. That's one problem. The second problem, or the second question is, what are the various different levels of tzaddik gamor, tzaddik she'ena gamor, complete tzaddik, incomplete tzaddik, a complete rasha, an incomplete rasha, and a beinoni? Thirdly, how can Eov say that God created tzaddikim and created rishayim if our sages tell us that being a tzaddik or a rasha, being good or bad, is not something that's stated at a person's creation, but it's something given to our free choice? And another question we have to understand is, what exactly is this level of a beinoni? Certainly a beinoni is not somebody who's an intermediary person, meaning he's half sins and half merits, because number one, Rabbah would never make such a mistake. That's way too off the mark from what he actually was in real life. He certainly wasn't a half sinful person. And also because when somebody sins, at that moment of their sin, they're called a rasha. So if somebody who's purely righteous is a tzaddik, and somebody who does even one sin is a rasha, where exactly does a beinoni fall in? So we said that the beinoni is somebody who doesn't do any sins, not even wastes a moment from not learning Torah. But a beinoni is somebody who does not do any sins at all. And the only time we call a tzaddik as somebody who does some sins, it's only in court that we say, they're innocent. They're not going to be prosecuted. In other words, most of the time they're good. But the true title of a tzaddik is somebody who doesn't have a yetzer hara at all. And the beinoni then is somebody who does have a yetzer hara but doesn't use it to do bad things. And now we could understand what our sages tell us, that every Jew has 2 souls living inside of them. One soul comes from the side of evil, the side of klipa sitra achra, and that's the vivifying soul, which keeps the person alive and also allows the person to come to sin. It provides him with negative traits and tendencies, 4 different types based on the 4 water, fire, air, and earth that are in the spiritual soul. However, because this animalistic soul in a person is from the shining klipa, therefore it has some good, such as compassion and kindness, and that's the good part of that animalistic soul. However, the nations of the world, which come from klipos and sitra achra, from the 3 completely ungodly klipos, therefore they don't have that natural draw towards goodness. As our sages say, that even when a nation of the world does kindness, they only do it for some other external factor. And in chapter 2, we're going to talk about the essence of the holy soul that every Jew possesses. Thank you for joining us.